some of you know, we have a grandbaby. And hey, this is where Julie is right now. And I'm concerned that I'm not going to get her back over here. I'm a little bit concerned about that. But try to give you a few extra pictures. There's Kalella and baby Ananias Wesley Albritton is his name. Wesley is what we'll be calling him. There's his papa and baby. And Seth was the first sibling that got to be there and hold him. But also Anna Claire got to hold him. And Joel got to hold him. Even Noah has gotten to hold him. I have not gotten to hold him yet. This is like bothering me. I'm seeing all these pictures. And then just to let you know again that she's just very comfortable where she is. I don't know. The girls and I may be on our own for now, but we are going to get to go tomorrow. But there he is. He was born Thursday at 3:17 and has a head full of hair. But we are certainly excited. I figured you wouldn't mind me showing you a bunch of pictures of him. I actually could just leave that up there for a little bit longer, but I do want to talk about a baby, but there's a different baby we're going to talk about. However, his dad, Harris, I want you to know there was a time, it was actually 19 years ago this year, we had this great idea of having, of being educational at Christmas. And we were getting LEAP pads and getting them to be able to have this fun stuff because LEAP pads were kind of a fun thing back then. And but this was not what Harris was expecting. In fact, when he opened his presents and saw what it was with a pretty deadpan face and statement, he said, well, maybe next year we'll get what we really want. And we just kind of went on with Christmas the rest of that day. But that was not what he was expecting. And because he was not expecting it, sometimes, as we talked about, Carlton mentioned a few weeks ago, sometimes those expectations are predetermined resentment. And there was that he had some expectations of what was going on, and when they weren't met, it was such a letdown. It's like, gosh, I thought it was going to be something bigger, something better, and that's not what it was. But it was, and when we come to Christmas time, there are a lot of expectations that we have. I mean, we are expecting family to be together. We're expecting certain presents. We're expecting a lot of different things. And when we don't get our expectations, sometimes it makes us disappointed. There's just a sense of, that's not what I was expecting. Well, when we were going back 2,000 years to when Jesus was born, when there were people that were expecting a Messiah, but Jesus was not really what they were expecting. So when he came, there was a lot of people that missed it, and even as he continued in his life, there were expectations that were not being met, and so it was a letdown. And when we think about this, when we come to understanding a little bit more of who Jesus is and what he has done, if it's different, if our expectations were less than what he was going to give us, or it was different than what he's given us, we could find ourselves in a place where we're pretty disappointed and discouraged by what we have seen and what we're learning. But the reality is, going back to what we talked about with the promises, we can be assured, and this is where it requires some faith and the hope that he gives us, that what we expect, even if our expectations are not met, they will be exceeded if we'll wait and see what he has. Now, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds. I think you can do it faster than this, but I want you to think about this. It'll give you 30 seconds to figure out how far you are from your hometown. So if you live here and this is not your hometown, how far are you from your hometown right now? Just kind of look real quick. You can tell the people who are right beside you. 88 miles. That's interesting to me. We're going to come back to that in just a minute because that's Hopewell. Yeah. What'd you say? 5 miles. Okay. 1,200. Now you're getting more in my range. Actually, you exceeded my range. 1429. Okay, because you're in the middle of the country. What did you say, Joel? 1,000. Oh, you like when? Where were you born? Oh, so you were even further out than Tim, and further than Nebraska apparently. Anybody else? Here is Vicksburg, Mississippi, where I was born. I looked up actually the last house that I lived in growing up. And from my house to this house was 1,025 miles. So that's how far away from my hometown. Now, if President Biden said, all right, we're going to do a new kind of census, and everybody has to go back to where you were born and register there, and you're going to have to pay taxes based on that area and whatever it was that, whatever the reasoning was behind what they were doing as far as the census and trying to figure out who was paying, making sure everybody's paying the right number of taxes. You'd go back to your hometown and experience some of that. For Mary and Joseph, that was the dilemma that they found, that they had called a census and everybody had to go back to their place of origin and do the census there, and they'd figure out all the things that were necessary for them. This is going back to Hopewell, is from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Now this is, they say it was around 90 miles. Again, I just looked at modern day stuff. The way it's listed as 96 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So this is the journey that they ultimately had to take to get to Bethlehem in order to be there for the census, which ultimately was, some of this is interesting to me to think about, and that when the angel came to Mary and when the angel came to Joseph and told them what was going on, that was hard to wrap their head around. And I just wonder if there was anything in them that began to think, well, if this is the Messiah, should we try to learn a little bit more about what to expect? I mean, if there was anything in them that began to research, what were some of the prophecies that were told? What were some of the things that God told us were going to happen about this Messiah? Or if they were just so overwhelmed, they were like, oh my gosh, there's too much to do between now and when the baby comes. I don't know I can't even think about that. But if there was something in them that thought, we're in Nazareth, and we know that the prophecy says that they're going to be in Bethlehem, so how is that doesn't make sense. We're not just going to go down to Bethlehem for the baby to be born. How's that going to work out? And then this is thrown in through the government. They are required to go. So they have to make this journey from 96 miles. Now, Larry, if you had to take Patty back to Hopewell without a car or a vehicle, would that work? How would that work? Y'all walk a lot, so maybe it would be okay. Maybe y'all would be all right. But if she was pregnant, it might be something different. But they had to go these 96 miles to get back to Bethlehem, and the reason they had to go to Bethlehem in that day, I mean, the reason they had to go is because they had to go for the census. But God had orchestrated through the government to get them back to Bethlehem because there was something else important about Bethlehem, and that was because that's where the Messiah was supposed to be born. That was one of the things that they were told of the expectation of what was going to happen was that he was going to be born in Bethlehem. Now, I think it's important to understand a little bit, or it helps us wrap our head around it a little bit more if we understand the history of what Bethlehem is. Now, here's where we're going to start. Beth, like the term Beth, is house. It means house. So if you Bethel is El is God, so it's house of God. That's what that is. Bethany is house. There's two things. One, they think it could have been house of affliction, or it could be house of figs, which is a little bit different. Affliction and figs. However, there's and I've never pronounced it this way until I heard somebody talking about it just this week, but Bethphage is how they pronounce this in, I guess, in Hebrew. I always say Bethpage because I just skip the H that's in there, the extra H that's in there. But it actually means house of unripe figs. And they're in Bethany and those two towns are pretty close together. So I thought maybe it is figs. Maybe one of them is unripe and then they ship it over to Bethany whenever they're ripe figs. I don't know. But anyway, that's just the idea that Beth is house of. And Lehem is the house of bread. So that's what Bethlehem means. Now, there are a couple of times in the Old Testament, actually a few very significant times in the Old Testament, that Bethlehem is mentioned, either by name or by another name of the name of the people that lived there. And here's the first one: is Genesis chapter 35, verse 19. First time it's mentioned. So Rachel died. Jacob's wife, one of Jacob's wives, Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. That is Bethlehem. So that's the first time that we start hearing about this town that was there. She was buried there, so it had a significant impact on the people of God because Rachel was a pretty significant person in their history and what all the role that she played with Jacob and the birth of Joseph and Benjamin and all. So she was buried there. So that's the first thing that we began to learn about it. And then we learn that there are some other things that began happening because as she went there, some of God's people, and then when they moved into the Promised Land, they began to occupy that place, and it became an important city. So in Ruth chapter 1, we learn of something else that's taken place there. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, so the judges were in the process. This is prior to them having a king. There was a famine in the land. And this part is a little bit interesting to me because where they are, a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to live in the land of Moab for a while. And the reason they went to live in the land of Moab, because there was a famine, which means there's no food, there was no bread in the house of bread. There was nothing there for them to eat. So they moved to Moab to live for a while. And I know some of you know this story and all, but let's walk through it some. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the name of their sons was Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they entered the land of Moab and settled there. So they moved out of the house of bread because there was no bread to live in Moab for a little while, and they took their 2 sons with them. Now, while they were there, some tragic things happened. Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And her 2 sons took Moabite women as their wives. Now, one was named Orpah, and this, just for interest's sake, was what Oprah's named after, except her mom put the R on the other side of the P by accident. At least that's the story she told. And one was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. So these were her daughters-in-law. Her husband died, and she was left there with her sons and her daughters-in-law. Her sons, as would have been the case back then, would have taken over the headship of the family, and she would have been living there, and they would have been supporting her as well as their families. And they lived together, and that was just how tightly knit their family stayed, and the importance of that. And there's going to be a time in 2022 we're going to talk about families and the importance of connectivity and why the Bible talks about the church as a family and how that is. We'll get into all that. But it was very important for them. So they were all staying together. And but after they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. and Naomi was left with without her 2 children and without her husband. So now all the men that were in her life had died and were no longer there. So she was going to be, just in the way, the customs of that time, she was going to be without a means of support. So she had her 2 daughters-in-law and said, I can't, I have no way to support myself, much less support you. So you're still young. Why don't you go back to your father's house, and maybe you can marry again, and certainly your father is going to take care of you if you go back there, and everything, you can just get back to your life. I'll go back to my people. I'll find family there. I'll make it work. But let's just do that. There was resistance among the daughters-in-law. They said, we don't want to leave you. But Orpah eventually decided, I'll just go back to my dad and my family, and they'll take care of me. But Ruth said, no, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going back. I'm staying with you. And so Ruth replied, do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. It's such a beautiful commitment and a beautiful picture of what Ruth wanted to do, to stick with Naomi. And Naomi, maybe reluctantly, I would imagine there was she was reluctant in this, but she eventually let her. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her, and the 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. So they went back to Bethlehem, where there was now food. There was now bread, and they were going to find a place. Now, if you go back and look through the book of Ruth, it's only 4 chapters long. I would encourage you to go back and read it and see what happened in the story and what ultimately happened with them. Ruth ends up marrying a kinsman redeemer of Naomi, and his name is Boaz. Boaz, interestingly, was a son of Salmon, and I'm going through in my head of the song, Rahab from Jericho. I mean, it's thinking about how closely some of these events are connected. Rahab, who was in Jericho, who put the scarlet cord out of the window so they would know where she was to protect her, and she was supporting the Israelites as they came and attacked Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, and she was saved. Salmon ended up becoming her husband. They had Boaz. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer for Naomi and ultimately married Ruth. They had Obed, and Obed had Jesse. And then Jesse was the father of 8 sons, one of which was David. Now, if you are Andrew Peterson fans like we are, and if you have sung with us the Matthew's Begat song, this is partially where they believe Matthew got some of this from, this genealogy. This is at the end of Ruth. So this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram or Aram in some translations, who fathered Amminadab, who fathered Nahshon, who fathered Salmon, with Rahab fathered Boaz. Ruth, she married Boaz, who had Obed, who had Jesse. This is the words to the song Matthew's Begat. This is how I can remember this. Who had Jesse, who had David, who we know as king. I mean, this is the king. This is the connection that Ruth had. But the reason they were back in Bethlehem is originally because Rachel was buried there, and so some of the family settled there. And then ultimately, they had a famine, and we're going to come back to this idea, but just the idea of the famine in Bethlehem, with Bethlehem being without bread, and them leaving and then ultimately coming back and settling there again. David being born in Bethlehem, which kind of fast forwards everything up to where we are with why Joseph, who was in the line of David, had to go back to Bethlehem because that's where his family was from, and what they are doing. Now, with that in mind, with David there, David stayed there with the family. He was the youngest of the 8 sons, and Samuel was told by God as they got a king, but it wasn't the king that was good for them. So the Lord told Samuel, "How long are you going to mourn over Saul?" Because Saul wasn't the king that they expected. It was really who Samuel expected. Samuel actually expected it to be like this, and he was still finding disappointment. But the people did not expect that, so they were resentful and beginning to get resentful. So he goes, "How long are you going to mourn over Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem because I've selected a king from his sons." So the king is coming from Bethlehem. Ultimately, there's a prophecy that comes about years later of saying that there's going to be a king, there's going to be another king, a Messiah that's going to come from the house of David, and he's going to be born in Bethlehem. And this is from Micah chapter 5, from the prophet Micah. This is some of the last things that people hear from God before this 400 years of silence. "Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. One will come from you and be the ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity." That means he's like from way back. This from far back, from eternity. He goes on to say, not just way back. He's just from eternity. I mean, he's existed forever, and he's going to be the Messiah that's going to come. If he's coming to Bethlehem, Bethlehem is where he's going to ultimately born, because that's where the King David, where his family is, and it's going to be in his line. So ultimately, he's going to be from there. So as Joseph is beginning to learn a little bit more of, maybe he had been reminded of some of this, maybe he's just learning some of this as he goes. But Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David. So this is their 96-mile journey that they took, so that they could be registered along with Mary. He could be registered along with Mary, who he is engaged to and was pregnant. So they make their way back to Bethlehem, to this house of bread, to have a baby. And ultimately, this baby becomes, he stirs up a lot of controversy and a lot of emotion among the people there. And in Matthew, we learn that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived unexpectedly in Jerusalem. Wait a second, we weren't expecting you. What are you doing here? You coming in here to find out where he who has been born King of the Jews, where he is. For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, this caused some problem. We've been through this in the past, but King Herod had a lot of mental health issues and a lot of control issues, and he was very power hungry in a lot of ways. He killed family members, including sons and wives, because they threatened his throne. So when he heard that there was another king being born, he was deeply disturbed. Now, if you knew the history of King Herod, you would understand why all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him. We know what you're about. We know how you get when you're disturbed. We know how you get when you feel threatened. And so this is making us all concerned. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. And then they went back to this prophet Micah. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because this is what was written by the prophet. "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, because out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people, Israel." So he called the prophets back together, or the priests back together, and they looked up and said, okay, he's actually going to be born in Bethlehem. As we look at the prophecies, we weren't really expecting that. We were told that, but we weren't really expecting that. We were thinking maybe something else. If God was going to come in, it wouldn't come in through Bethlehem. We kind of overlooked that part. But he's going to be born in Bethlehem. It turns out that in his deranged mind, King Herod decided, well, I don't want to take any chances. He called the Magi back in and said, when was it that you saw the star? Because We want to know about when it was. They told him it was probably sometime within the 2 years, because King Herod said, well, we're going to make sure we take care of this. Go to Bethlehem and kill all of the kids that are 2 years or younger, all the male kids that are 2 years or younger. So that took place. It was just a horrific thing that happened. Jesus and Mary and Joseph escaped to Egypt, ultimately went back, and Jesus came up and began his ministry. Now, there was a very, oh man, what did I just do? There was a very significant event or a significant teaching that Jesus had that I think connects us back to this understanding of Bethlehem and why it was important, not just because of the kingly line of David, but also some of the things that he ultimately points out. And it was controversial in the sense that when Jesus finished this teaching, there were a lot of followers that just said, man, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting something different to come from you. And because it is like this, I'm out. I'm not wanting to follow anymore. But Jesus came back. It seems somewhat simple enough as we start out. But he feeds 5,000 people, and they begin to kind of rally around him and say, oh man, we want more of this. I mean, show us more, perform more so we can see what all you're doing. And Jesus stops them and he says, wait, you've come not because of that, not because of you're wanting more, really wanting me. You're just wanting more of the show. And he begins to explain this. And then Luke records it this way in chapter 6. Jesus says, I am the bread of life, Jesus told them. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. Well, this was coming off and directed toward people who had just experienced this miraculous feeding of 5,000 plus people with just a few fish and a few loaves of bread. And so they began this conversation happening between them, and Jesus says, but there's even more to it than this. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm the bread of life. And unless you eat my flesh, which is the bread of life, and unless you drink my blood, you will not be able to have life. I mean, because that is where life is found in me. And as he begins to tell this and say this, people are horrified by this. A little bit later in this chapter, Jesus said to them, I assure you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life in yourself. Anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day, because my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. The one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, I live because of the Father. So the one who feeds on me will live because of me. Now he gets through with this, and they're like, "What? You're wanting me?" I mean, they're thinking literally and physically. We're supposed to eat your flesh. This is why some of the people in the first century thought that the people who followed Jesus, were cannibals. They thought they ate each other, ate people. But Jesus was talking more in terms of that he was the bread of life. And if you would feed off of him and his blood, it meant something so much more than just a drink, but it was something that would represent the sacrifice that he was going to give. But he was just communicating, though, that life was found in him and that he was the bread of life. He was the bread. Here's a confusing statement for you. The bread of life from the house of bread causes people to eat this bread in order to find life. That what Jesus was telling them was that he is the bread of life. He was born in Bethlehem, the house of bread, that was empty for a while. I mean, there was a period that there was a famine, there was no bread there. But he has come back in, and the bread of life has come from this house of bread. And Jesus is calling his people to eat this bread, to feed off of him so that they can find life and have it eternally. But the idea of him eating the flesh and drinking his blood and not being able to understand fully what Jesus was talking about was too much for some people. And they said, hey, yeah, we're done. We can't do this. What we expected of you, Jesus, we had expectations of the Messiah. We had expectations of what was going to happen. And you've thrown it way off. And they left disappointed, just discouraged, just confused. They couldn't embrace it. And sometimes I think we end up like them in some ways, in small ways, not always walking away from our faith, but in small ways that we hear the teaching of Jesus and go, oh, no. Surely that's not what he meant. I mean, that's what you're saying. I mean, this is what we're supposed to be like. And it becomes offensive to us because it was not really what we were expecting. We were expecting something else. And so it leads to resentment sometimes. And hopefully for us that we are surrounding ourselves with people who will continue to encourage us. And so even when we walk through those resentful moments or those times when we are questioning some of that we have other people that speak into our lives to help us through that so that we can come back to realize, okay, it wasn't what I was expecting, but really when we dig down to it, it's more. He's actually offering us more. And if we'd embrace this and feed off him in the way that he's called us to, that we can find life. He ultimately went in, as Luke recorded this, and they all have some sort of recording of this, the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, when Jesus was with his disciples the night before he was crucified, and he gave he took the bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them and said, "This is my body, which is given for you. So do this in remembrance of me." It's going back to that idea of, oh man, I am the bread of life. And this bread that we're eating in this ceremony, what I believe was the Seder celebration, and this moment that happened right after the meal when they brought him and he pulled it out of the afikomen and he began to break it off and give it to the people around the table. And he said, this is my body. Remember when that what I was talking about that caused so much controversy and so many people left because they didn't understand what I was talking about? This is what I'm talking about. This is my body. You eat this and you think about the sacrifice that I make and you think about what I've done and think about the things I've taught you. And even when you push back, even if it's something you don't fully understand, just trust me in this. Feed off me. Because when you do, you will discover life. And he went ahead and took the third cup. It's a cup of redemption. He said in the same way, he took the cup after the supper and said, "This cup is the new covenant established by my blood. It is shed for you." Remember that? Remember I said, drink my blood. This is what I'm talking about. So when you eat this bread and you drink the cup from the fruit of the vine, you are feeding off me. And life is found there. Life is found here. So going back to this little baby that was born in Bethlehem, maybe it wasn't exactly what we were expecting, but this little baby who was born in Bethlehem was actually the bread of life. He was the bread in the house of bread that brings life to us. So in this time of celebrating Bethlehem and Bethlehem's role in it and how it brought forth the bread of life for us, we're going to take a little bit of time to share in communion. We've over the last couple of years, or almost 2 years, we've been doing communion in this way, so that we won't pass it around to everybody, but we'll just invite you to come and take one of the cups. Just in case you're not familiar with it, the top part, you peel the top part off and you'll get the little wafer. That is the bread that Jesus said is representative of my body. So when you eat this, remember what I've done for you. Remember that I'm the bread of life. that brings forth all that you need and more. Maybe not exactly what you expected, but everything you need and more to have life. And then you can peel off the second part and you have the cup and you can drink the cup that represents the blood that Jesus shed for us so that we could have life. We could have forgiveness of sin and life in him. The band is going to come up also in a second. I'll give y'all a chance to grab the elements first and then come, and they'll lead us in a couple of songs to help us close out our time together. But just as you take those, if you've made a decision to follow Jesus, we invite you to participate with this and take the cup and the bread. And then they're going to lead us in a couple of songs that will hopefully let that settle in a little bit more, and then we'll wrap things up today. But if you'll join me in prayer right now. God, we thank you so much for sending the bread of life in advance, telling us that he would be coming to the house of bread and that we would find eternal and abundant life in him. So Lord, as we think about that and that kind of bounces around in our mind, Lord, I pray that you'd help us to be able to grab hold of the things that you've called us to in Jesus. And one of those is to partake in the life-giving bread and cup that Jesus offers us through his body and through his blood. So Lord, as we take these, that we remember the sacrifice that ultimately came about through this baby that was born in Bethlehem and laid in a manger and celebrated by shepherds. Lord, we pray your blessing on this time, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I will, and just invite you as you feel led to come, you come and take.